Algebra 1, Sensei Learning System, Lesson 24. Let's talk about domain and range. Domain describes all possible input for an equation or function. Let's say equation. Whereas range represents all possible output, or should I say answers, for an equation. Now, one of the best ways to see the domain and range is to see the graph, see the equation graphed. This equation is a parabola. Domain, we can look at how far it travels along the x-axis. And to find range, all possible outputs or answers, we can look how far the graph travels along the y-axis. So let's look at the x-axis first for the domain here. How far does it travel to the left, and how far does it travel to the right? Well, this graph right here, even though it's going up, is always getting wider, so it's always going to the left. And because it never stops getting wider, even though it's slowly widening, the domain to the left is negative infinity. This side on the right never stops getting wider, so it never stops traveling to the right. Therefore, the domain here on the right is positive infinity. This tells us right here that as far as input for this equation, there is no number that wasn't useful, or should I say it had all real values for input. So that's all the possible input, all real numbers. So see, all real numbers. Now, the range. Looking at all possible output, or the answers for a function. First I look at how low do the answers go along the y-axis. Well, the answers will not go any lower than 0. So 0 is my lowest. And it actually goes through 0, so I put a block here. Now, how high do my answers go? Well, according to the graph here, it never stops getting higher. So the height of my answers is positive infinity. Okay, again, let's look here. We want to find the domain of this function. The domain, we're looking at all possible x's or input. Along the x-axis, this part of the graph never stops getting wider, so it always goes to the left. Therefore, the domain to the left is negative infinity. This part of the graph never stops going to the right, because it gets wider and wider and wider as it goes. Therefore, to the right, it's positive infinity. This tells us that as far as the input is concerned, the equation that produced this could have used any number for input. So for input, it has all real numbers. Now the answers, or should I say the range. The answers here, how low do the answers go along the y-axis? The answers don't go any lower than 2. So we say the lowest answers are 2. And because it actually goes through 2, we include 2 by putting a bracket. Now what's the highest that the answers will go? Well, looking at the graph, these continuously go up, so your answers can go as high as positive infinity. And this is your range. Here, looking at the domain, how wide will this go, or how far will this go to the left along the x-axis? Well, this part right here never stops getting wider, so it will always go to the left. So that's negative infinity. How far does it go to the right along the x-axis? Well, this side right here never stops getting wider to the right, so it is also positive infinity. So we can see here the domain here is all real numbers. So all real numbers can be used in whatever created this equation as input. Now range. The lowest that this graph will go, we see that it continues to go down. So the lowest is actually negative infinity. So the answers will go as low as negative infinity. The highest the answers will go right here at the vertex right here will be negative 2. So negative 2. And since it goes through negative 2, it'll include, there's no circle there. If there's a circle there, it wouldn't include it, but there it's filled in. So it includes negative 2. Now this graph right here is a circle, and we want to look at the domain. The domain is how far does this graph go along the x-axis to the left. It doesn't go any further than this negative 4 right here. So we'll say the domain here doesn't go any further than negative 4, but it does include negative 4 to the left. As far as numbers to the right, it only goes as far as positive 4 right here. So we'll say the domain here is actually all the numbers from -4 to +4 can be used in the equation. You can't use -5, you can't use +5 in this particular equation or anything before or after. Now, the range. How low does this graph go along the y-axis? Well, according to this, it goes only as low as -4. So for the range, we would say it goes to -4, including -4. The highest that this graph will go is +4. So my range is no lower than -4, no higher than +4. Number 5, the domain. I will ask how far does this graph go to the left. The graph doesn't go any further than 0, so my domain to the left is 0, including 0. How far does the graph go to the right? Along the x-axis, it keeps going to the right, so that's +infinity. Now my range. First, how low does this graph go along the y-axis? Well, it doesn't go any lower than this 2 right here. It actually stops here at a point 2. So the lowest it goes is 2. Now what's the highest the graph goes? Well, it never stops climbing up. It's going to the right, but it's also climbing. So it never stops climbing, therefore it's +infinity. Okay, number 6, the domain. We look to the left and we see that this graph never stops going to the left. Therefore, that'll be -infinity. We see that it stops going to the right here when it gets to 0. So it doesn't ever go past 0 on the x-axis. So 0, and it does stop there actually at the point. So we'll say 0 is as far as it goes to the right. So those are the only numbers that you can use in this equation. Negative numbers and 0. Now the range tells us our answers. First we ask, how low does it go? This graph never stops going down. So the range, the answers will go as low as -infinity. The highest of the answers will go is right here at -2. So the highest the answers will go is -2, including -2. We can't get any answers that are higher than -2 from this function, like 1 or 7 or anything like that. On this graph right here, the domain, we look to how far does this graph go to the left. Well, it only goes as far as 2 right here. So to the left, it's 2. And how far does this graph go to the right along the x-axis? Well, according to this, it never stops going to the right. So we'll say +infinity. The range, which are the answers. How low does this graph go? This graph doesn't go any lower than -3 right here. So -3 is the cutoff for the answers. You can't get any answers that are any lower than -3 from the equation that produced this. And how high will the answers go? Well, even though this is going to the right, this is lifting, and it never stops lifting, or should I say rising. So it's always going up in some fashion. So that'll be +infinity there. Okay, number 8. Okay, first let's look at the domain and then the range. The domain is how far will this graph go to the left, and we see it's going wider and wider every time, so that's -infinity. How far will this go to the right? This is also getting wider and wider to the right, so that's +infinity. Or should I say all real numbers. Now the range, the lowest that this graph will go is -3. It will not go any lower than -3, so that's the bottom of the range, -3. Answers don't go any lower than that. Now how high will these go? Well, these are going up on both sides, so we're going to capture all numbers going up to infinity. So we'll say to the right is infinity. Okay, number 9. Let's look for domain. The domain will look to how far does this graph go to the left. Well, because of these arrows, we know that this never stops getting wider and wider, so it will keep going to the left forever. So that's -infinity. And on the right side, we see that it keeps getting wider still, therefore it never stops traveling to the right. So that'll be +infinity. Now the range, looking at the answers that this graph will produce. First, let's look how low the answers go. Well, according to these pieces right here, they never stop getting lower. See these arrows? They never stop. So the bottom of the range is -infinity. The highest the answers will go is this point, this vertex right here, which kind of stops at 1, doesn't go any further. So it's 1, and it also includes 1. So that's our range. On this last graph right here, how far does this graph go to the left and right will be our domain. So it never stops going to the left because this gets wider and wider. So that's negative infinity. And it never stops going to the right because this gets wider and wider, which makes it positive infinity, which is all real numbers. It's a bad way to write that. Okay, now let's look at the range. And we don't have much room for the range, but we don't need much room for the range. The range, first we look at how low this graph will go. It will only go as low as 2. It won't go any further past this vertex. So no lower than 2, and it includes 2. How high will this graph go? It will keep going up and never stop. So the rise on here is positive infinity. So our range is from 2 included to positive infinity.